I forgot to ask. Is it Graulau?
It's Grolo.
Grolo. Awesome. All right. So here with Bianca Graulau, a great independent journalist and content creator. I'm super excited to have you on the show. I've been meaning to have you on the show for a little while now. Very excited to have you on. How are you tonight?
I'm good. Thank you so much for the invitation. Sorry that it took a little bit to make this happen.
No, well, it's great that it's happening now. So, everybody, welcome to A Pretty Normal Podcast, and let's get it started. Awesome. Happy Thursday to everybody who is watching. Welcome to A Pretty Normal Podcast. We are joined here by Bianca Graulau, an amazing independent journalist, reporter, content creator. You do a great job covering all the issues down in Puerto Rico. Although recently you did make a video that was not about Puerto Rico. It was actually about how Venezuelans living in Colombia are using Bitcoin to survive. So you're obviously branching out, not just Puerto Rico. Before that, I saw some great stories that you told about this woman, this transgender woman, I think from Southern California. So please do tell me about yourself. Tell me about how you got into journalism, how you got into reporting, how you got into content creation. And I think that would be a great place to start.
Yeah, so I've actually just started reporting on Puerto Rico recently because the early years of my career, I was living in different places. So I started in Palm Springs. So I was telling local stories there. Then I moved to Sacramento and I was there for 3 years telling stories there too. And then Florida, I lived in Tampa and then in Miami. I had always wanted to come home and tell stories from home. And I think I started feeling that pull a little stronger after Hurricane Maria. So after the hurricane happened, I just felt like it was great to be telling stories from the community where I was living. But I just felt this need to come home and tell the stories that were happening here. And I did, I came home for a week right after the hurricane and I told some stories here, and then I went back afterwards, but I kept wanting to come back. So that plus my dad had an accident. So I came to take care of him. The pandemic happened. So everything just created the perfect storm for me to kind of stay. And then at the same time, I had just been really wanting to tell some stories from here. So that's what I'm doing now. So I quit my job that I had where I was based in Miami. And then I just started doing stories here.
Can you just give me 1 second? I forgot to turn my light on.
No problem.
All right. I was like, why am I so dark? All right. So I was looking into it. So you have the video that kicked it all off, I think, that said kind of why did I decide to quit my job during a pandemic, which is the first video I saw. It let me know a little bit about your story. So you've been doing news reporting since 2012. In 2016, prior to this big move, you decided that you wanted to just pick up a camera and go tell stories on your own. You did say that although that you chose to do that then, you were still driving Lyft and teaching English to kids in China to subsidize your income because Lord knows that being an independent content creator is hard and sometimes it don't pay the bills. So what made you then decided to end up getting two more news jobs after that? So it was kind of like you tried it once, decided to go back to, I guess, a little bit more of the established news role, and then decided pandemic is here. Why not move back home? First off, were you born in Puerto Rico?
Yeah, born and raised.
Born and raised? What time did you move to like the mainland?
When I graduated high school. So when I went to college, I went to Syracuse, New York, and I was here for 4 years, going back and forth, coming back home for breaks. But then once I graduated college, then I officially moved over there.
Moved there, and you were working for some great networks such as Univision, ABC. I saw like these are very, very solid known news agencies and stuff, and I think it's tough, like especially during a pandemic, to decide I'm going to be independent, I'm going to work for myself, and I'm going to put it in the hands of the people who enjoy my work by creating like a Patreon. especially during a pandemic when people are so financially unstable that, you know, they for themselves don't have money. How could they just be giving it out to people whose content they're watching stuff? So did you ever have any doubts? Like, were you ever like, you know, I'm in a pretty solid place. Like I should probably just stay where I'm at.
100%. I mean, it's not an easy decision to make. And to go back to what you were saying, the first time I tried it in 2016, I was really feeling that urge, right? I felt like I loved what I did, but I didn't really love doing it for the people I was doing it for. And I also felt that there was great opportunity on social media that established news stations and networks were not taking full advantage of. And I get it. I mean, it was new for everyone, but I just felt like there were ways that we can make it work and we weren't really trying. So then 2016, I just grabbed the camera with my friend and we went to tell stories. And it's funny you bring up the hesitation to like start a Patreon because I was just thinking about this today. Back in 2016, I remember posting on Facebook and being candid about it, being like, listen, we are loving what we're doing. We have no clue how to monetize this, but we're having a blast. So we're going to do it for now and see what happens. And I remember someone saying, why don't you start a Patreon? And I was like, I don't feel comfortable taking people's money, you know? And now this second time around, well, two things changed. Number one, you know, I put myself in a position where I was a little bit more stable and I just cut my costs. It's not the same to be living in the US paying high rent than coming back home and literally living in the home where I grew up, just cutting my costs and living very simply. And number two, I still had hesitation, but enough people had asked about how to support me through a platform like Patreon that I was like, okay, fine, I'll start it. And to be honest with you, I haven't really promoted it. I kind of, you know, mentioned it in that video and just put the link and that was it. And it's funny how my perspective has started to change. There's this woman, she's a musician. Her name is Amanda Palmer. And I found out about her through one of my patrons. So I start my Patreon, a few people sign up, and I'm still trying to get used to it and how to give them value and also accept their generosity. Like you said, it's during such a tricky time. But one of my patrons sends me the link to the TED Talk of this woman. Her name is Amanda Palmer. And she talked about the art of asking. And she talks about how she has funded her career directly with her fans giving her the money, and how she talks about, again, the art of asking and the connection that it allows her to build with the people who enjoy her art and her content. And I started thinking about it and I was like, that's what I've been doing. You know, my highest tier on Patreon, what I offer is a monthly call. And my idea for doing that was to help people, give them tips if they wanted to start their own YouTube channel, if they wanted to create videos. I could just tell them about how I do it and see how I could help them. And I have those monthly calls and I have a connection with them that I otherwise wouldn't. And I'm telling you, these are like all kinds of different people, you know, some who are Puerto Rican, some who are not, some who have Puerto Rican students. So they want to learn more about Puerto Rico so that they can relate to them more. People who live in different places. And not only do they give me money every month, but they help me with resources. They're like, what do you need? Who do you need to connect with? Who do you need to interview for this? Here's a link for this. I just applied to a fellowship because one of my patrons sent me a link for a fellowship. So all of this to say that it has allowed me to have that direct contact with the people who consume my content that I otherwise wouldn't have had. I mean, when I worked for NBC, ABC, whatever it was, I just got my monthly paycheck and I didn't necessarily have that connection. And I think Amanda Palmer describes in a beautiful way just how it gets rid of that space between the creator and the people consuming and enjoying your content. And it becomes more of like, we're all in this together. Because the reality is that a lot of the people who watch my stories, they want this content created because they can't find it anywhere else. They want these stories told. There's stories that's why I left, because it's just not easy to create them when you're working for mainstream stations and networks. So they want this created and they want to support it if they can. So yes, it still feels weird, but I am trying to get comfortable with the fact that it's not just me. I'm not just doing this so that I can get a monthly paycheck and move on with my life. We're doing this together because we believe these stories need to be told. And if they want to be part of that, I am getting comfortable with accepting that and saying, okay, let's do it together.
That's awesome. And yeah, I think it's a great like cultural shift where now we're funding
Mm-hmm.
creators as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
funding the networks that hire them, because it's
Mm-hmm.
like you're giving directly to somebody you know is creating the content that you watch. And I think that with the rise of the internet, just like people got too used to like, all right, everything online, I could just watch it for free and then go on to the next thing. And like without knowing how much work goes into videos, like it seems like you operate the drone as well. You film, you do the narrations and everything. Like how did you get into content creation? Is this something you studied at school, or how did you learn about this?
Yeah, so I went to Syracuse and I studied broadcast journalism and political science. So I was taught everything from, shooting to editing to the content behind my stories to how to tell them. I will say it was a very traditional sort of education. I learned how to go and work at a local station and do things traditionally. I
Mm-hmm.
am really happy that now my professors call me to speak to students to kind of give them a perspective of how things have changed and the other options out there, because I do wish that I had known that the industry was changing at the time that I was studying.
Mm-hmm.
But what was great about my education, it was a very expensive education and it's at a very prestigious broadcast journalism school. But I I appreciate that I left knowing how to do every part of my story. And I will say that this is very common for news reporters. We resent having to do so much,
Mm-hmm.
especially when you're getting paid so little. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
we're talking like some people make 20 something thousand a year during their
Yeah,
first job.
that is
And
wild.
it is crazy. And they're, doing the research, they're shooting, they're editing, they're writing, they're looking good on camera, they're doing all these things. So on the one hand, we resented it because we're getting underpaid to do the job of 5 people. On the other hand, I'm really happy I learned how to do that because it became my craft. But then at
Mm.
some point, I am lucky enough that I was able to say, I don't resent it anymore because I'm not doing it for someone who could be paying me more, but is not paying me more. I'm doing it for myself. And I will be honest with you, sometimes I do feel, and I hope to get to a point where I can, work with people and pay them to be part of a team,
Mm-hmm.
because it is a heavy load. And I will tell
Yeah.
you that I was just telling my patrons the other day, I made a post where I was like, I woke up at 2:30 this morning because I work best when everything is quiet and when my
Mm-hmm.
dogs are asleep and not doing crazy things and I have to be looking after them. And I need that time. It's almost like I need all that extra time because I always underestimate how much time a story is going to take me to get done,
Mm-hmm.
from the researching to the editing, especially. I'm like, oh, I could get this done in like 2 days. And then 2 days means that I have to be working 10, 12 hours straight to get it done the way I want to. So
Mm-hmm. I feel that completely. Like I just, because I'm a video editor, so my job title, this is not my main job, is digital content producer. I make videos for a different company or whatever, but I spend my whole day just editing. And recently I started getting what is called a repetitive stress injury on my wrist. So like my wrist has been cramping up, and it's not carpal tunnel per se, but it's kind of like similar to it. And that is something that another friend of mine has been having issues with because she's a blogger. So she's all day just typing. And it's like these things where now like I have to like pay attention to my body and what I'm doing to, make sure that I don't overwork it. But there are like
mhm.
vertical mouses and stuff that I looked into. There's like all these different wrist braces, and there's a lot of different things that help now that I guess more jobs are like sedentary and you're just sitting at the desk all day and stuff. I wanted to ask you though, what advice would you give to reporters and journalists who might be coming out of college and don't know what they want to do? So my background is actually in journalism as well. I never thought I was going to actually do anything with it because I kind of thought the journalist role is you sit down at a desk and you write stories, and it's like the traditional role. It wasn't until later that I realized, oh, I kind of am doing something with it by using these interviews and like, talking to people. So there's more of like a different lane. Like if you want to do podcasts, you could still be a journalist and just do audio form. You could do video. There's a lot of different things. What advice would you give to like young journalists, young reporters out there?
Well, first of all, I wanted to say, if you find a solution for the pain feeling, let me know, because my hand also cramps up, especially this one.
Yeah, the right one, the
Sorry,
mouse,
and
right?
especially when I'm stressing out. Yes. And I'm like, and this hand just like cramps up and I keep going like this. It's like, I can't stop right now. I need to finish. Anyway, what I
It's
will
bad.
say, yeah. So what I will say and what I tell students, it's tricky because the reality is that we are in that sort of transition period where we know that what we've been doing doesn't necessarily work. We see that we're losing viewers for traditional news. We see that the ratings are going down. We see that the current model is not necessarily fair for the people working who, again, are underpaid and are doing too much. At the
Mhm.
same time, that it's not clear what the alternative is. Because as we're discussing, going independent is not easy. So I
No.
wouldn't necessarily, talk to students and say, don't go with the station, do things on your own, because it's not like the money's there waiting for you. Again, I did
Mhm.
this from a very privileged standpoint where I was able to, and again, I'm not like safe. I don't know that I'll be able to continue to do this long term unless I find a way to make it sustainable.
Mm.
So the reality is that I would want the students right now studying journalism to know that there are other options. I'm still part of some, like TV station groups where people talk about, I'm just graduating college and here's my demo reel and I'm going to send it to news directors. And I swear that I read that and it sounds so old school to me.
Yeah.
And I almost wonder, like, is this still working? Are we still doing this? Listen, I believe that local news is incredibly important,
Mhm.
and it's a shame to see how it's declining. But I also understand that we have to adapt to the way that people are consuming news. So I don't have the answer, and I'm trying to figure it out along the way. But I will say that we collectively have to come up with something. I do think we need to make better use of social media. I do think that people have to understand that if they want quality journalism, they need to support it with their dollars. Because part of the problem is that we depend on advertising, which
Yeah.
creates a bunch of other issues, right? Like in the past, people would think, what's normal is that you work for a station and you get paid your paycheck, but that money is coming from advertisers that we don't necessarily know if the values of what we're reporting on align with the companies that are advertising with us. That's the first issue. And then the second issue being that, viewership goes down and the advertisers go away. So then you're losing very important journalism that's really important accountability in your community. So I think we need to start looking at it in a different way. And I'm really grateful that there's a lot of people willing to pay. And some subscription models do work. Like you see the New York Times and they do
Mhm.
have a steady like subscription base that they've been able to do great things with. So we have to figure out a way that we can make it sustainable and that people understand that if you're not paying for something, then if you're not paying it with your dollars, then you are the product, like we see on social media. So I don't have the answer, but I do wish that the conversation was more honest when
Mhm.
people are going to journalism school. Because to be honest with you, I can't see current journalism students watching the news at 5 and 6. I didn't do that when I was going to Syracuse.
No.
I only watched it if I had to do it for an assignment, but I didn't
Mhm.
naturally, at 18 years old, 20 years old, sit down to watch the 5 p.m. news. And when I was older, when I was 24 and 25, working at the local market in Sacramento, for example, the only reason I watched the local news is because I was working in local news. So I wanted to
Mhm.
see the story of the day and what the competitors were doing. So I don't think it's realistic to be educating a whole generation of journalists to work in an area that they wouldn't watch otherwise,
Yeah.
So that's a long way of saying I don't have an answer, but I do think that collectively we need to be more serious about looking for that answer.
Yeah. And I think that as like somebody who's thinking of going independent or just working for themselves, I think it's hard because you look at these big, like you mentioned the New York Times, like that is a historic news company that has been around forever. And you look at that and you're like, how could I compete with that? Like people are just going to
Mm.
go get their news from there. And there's so many other ones, the Washington Post, CNN, CNBC, like MSNBC. There's so many. And you look at it and you're like, how do I compete with that? So then I feel like most people are just like, well, I'm just going to go work there. Do you think though that as being an on-air personality on the screen, like you did get a following from your work at those stations that then followed you later on that were like, hey, I really like the way that she reports this news. Like I want to keep, following her.
A little bit, but I will say that I wasn't able to fully take advantage of that until I was independent.
Mm-hmm.
I have never gotten the views that I've gotten when I do things on my own, working for a channel or a network, which is crazy because these networks and stations have brand recognition. Everyone
Yeah.
knows what NBC is, everyone knows what CBS is, everyone knows what Univision is. But again, they were just not taking full advantage of social media, and they were also not letting me experiment with it. So when I
Mm-hmm.
wasn't working with them in 2016, when I left my job and I was able to do things the way I wanted, I got 7 million views in the story that you mentioned with the transgender woman.
Mm-hmm.
When I did stories on my own YouTube channel, I have a video that's almost at 1 million views on YouTube. I have never been able to get those numbers when I'm working for, an established platform that's connected to like a network, to one of the
Mm-hmm.
networks that we recognize. And I think it's a missed opportunity. And yes, I had a very small following. To be honest with you, my following has increased once I left because I was restrained or restricted in the ways that I could post on social media. That's what happens when you work for the stations and networks. They have rules. You can post certain things, but there are things that were not okay with you posting. So there was a lot I couldn't do. But
Mm-hmm.
once I left the job and I had the freedom to post, I've been able to grow my TikTok by a lot. I've been able to continue to grow my YouTube channel. So I will say that, yeah, in the different markets, I had a little bit of a following, but it wasn't until I left and I had the freedom to really experiment with my content that I started getting more eyeballs on my content.
Wow. And so you said that in 2016 you had gone to the Standing Rock protests and you had documented that. You had done some work down at the border when the whole thing was happening with the separating of children. Did you feel any change in public attitude towards journalists and reporters around the 2016 time when Donald Trump kind of coined the term fake news? Did you feel any public attitude change towards like journalists and like more antagonistic in any way?
Kind of. I think one of the unfortunate things about social media is that it creates bubbles, right? So if one of my stories is doing well, it's most likely because the people consuming it, are okay with that content, so to speak. Yes, there are, and it also depends what platform, right? I think on Facebook you get a lot more of the conservative comments. On TikTok you get more left side comments. So it depends. But I did see it and I did feel it depending on what I covered. For example,
Mm-hmm.
I did a story when Trump went to Tampa for a rally, and I mean, I had never been flipped off and called
You
fake
went down
news.
there?
And yeah, so I went to cover sort of what was happening outside at these rallies. A lot of times you would get Trump supporters and opponents, so to speak, or people who were Democrats and liberals, and they would just like form lines like facing each other and yell at each other and say a bunch of things. So then I was there documenting what was happening on both sides. And yeah, I got called
Wow.
things and flipped off, and I did a video on that. So I did feel that at times, but it doesn't compare with what some of my colleagues have gone through, when they covered some of these stories. So at times I have seen it on social media too. You get these comments and people start fighting in the comments. So I think I had always had comments that, were critical of my reporting, which I welcome. I want to hear people's perspectives. But, at some point they do get to the point where they're not productive, where it's just
Mm-hmm.
like, it's fake news. And no matter how much you back up your reporting, it just doesn't matter because they don't want hearing that. So for example, talking about the election, I would do just a video kind of explaining the current situation and say there's no evidence that there was election fraud, and then they would say you're lying. Yeah, there is. So how do you fight that? So you
That's
you
it.
do, yeah, you do see that in the comments, but I can't say that I was the target of like very vicious attacks like I've seen some of my colleagues go
For
through.
sure. Yeah. The question, yeah, it was more about just like the general attitude and the way that it describes. It sounds like way to like a job that we were already saying is super stressful, that you have to do so much, you're underpaid, and now to add in all of this like antagonistic behavior towards reporters and journalists, like it just makes it so much worse because I don't know if Donald Trump himself coined that term or where it came from, but like he definitely popularized it, and it's going to be something that continues even after his presidency. I think we're still going to see this type of like antagonistic like behavior towards the media, and that's really a shame. I think that's going to be like a large part of his legacy, just like kind of creating this division and this suspicion towards the media and stuff. All right, so you moved during the pandemic back to Puerto Rico. Did you ever think like, wait, I got to be on the mainland to vote? Like, this is an important election.
Not really, because I see myself very much part of my community wherever I am in the moment. And I've moved around a lot, but Puerto Ricans can't vote. And that's the reality. And even though I was younger than 18 the whole time that I lived here before I moved away, that has been the reality of my parents, and that has been the reality of my grandparents and my cousins, So I did get to participate in US elections when I was living in the States. But once I moved here, I think I appreciate being able to report from these issues or about these issues, going through it myself. You know what I mean? I sometimes, we're told a lot of times, and I was just about to do a video on TikTok about this today, how a lot of times we're told to like distance yourself from the story. But I also think that it's important to recognize that we're humans. We're reporters. We're also humans, and we go through these things too. So, I did do a video on TikTok talking about how I kept getting these calls because I used to live in the States and I was registered over there. I kept getting calls being like, don't forget to vote this election. And I would respond with, I moved to Puerto Rico. I can't vote. They're like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. And going through that, I think gives me the perspective of being like closer to my audience and closer to the people that I am reporting on, because I also know what it feels like to not be able to participate in an election that's going to have huge repercussions when it comes to what happens in Puerto Rico and the people who live here. So no, I didn't have that feeling of like, oh, I wish I stayed there to vote. I did have the feeling of I need to raise my voice and talk from the perspective of facts. Like, I'm telling you my experience, but also let me tell you the facts of what's happening. This is a thing, and it has been going on for a while. Puerto Ricans can't vote for you as president.
And you lived in California, right? So I feel like it's a blue state. I live in New York, so I know like it's a blue state. It's going blue, so not too much to miss there. I have to ask because it was so recent. So Logan Paul made the announcement that he's moving to Puerto Rico. He very clearly said he was doing it for tax reasons and a couple other reasons, but he made sure to let everyone know that he was not hiding it. He was going to move there for tax reasons so that he would not pay as much as he did in California. Like he was very transparent about that. He did make comments such as like, oh, I thought it was going to be way more third world than it actually was. But when I got there, it was like heaven on earth and stuff. But like he's going to be moving to Dorado, which I believe is like a wealthier community. I imagine he's going to live in a gated community. What were your thoughts when Logan Paul made this announcement? I saw that you made a couple stories about it.
Yeah. So again, my role here is to give people context and give people the facts. This law and this policy is not new. And I have reported on it in the past. You can go to my Facebook page and you can see videos that people were sharing again once this Logan Paul thing happened, where I am talking to one of the people responsible for inviting a lot of wealthy U.S. residents to move to Puerto Rico. And I am asking him questions about this. I'm sitting down with peers talking to him about, why he moved to Puerto Rico and the criticism of his move to Puerto Rico. So this is not new, but a lot of people are just learning about it because of Logan Paul. He's a public figure and a controversial one. So it has people talking again. So what did I think? I thought this is a good opportunity to give people the facts of what's happening, so that people understand what this means. And I think the other thing is that I report in English, and I think I report for an audience to kind of bridge the gap between the audience in Puerto Rico that consumes mostly Spanish local news and the audience in the US, both Puerto Rican diaspora and just US citizens or residents, who might not get that information, right? It's actually very interesting because in Puerto Rico, I remember since I was little watching the news and seeing like US news being reported as international news. And I think a lot of people don't know this, that Puerto Ricans see themselves as a nation, and then they see the United States like a distant thing. We very much understand that we're part of the United States, but here people are consumed by what's happening locally. It's all about the local politics and the local controversies. So I think I bridge that gap because I think it's very important that Puerto Ricans are also involved in what happens in U.S. Puerto Rico relations, right? It determines so much of what happens here. And so I think it's important for just U.S. residents to understand the role that their country and the role that their government has in the lives of Puerto Ricans. So I try to bridge that gap, and I think that's what I can provide when something like the Logan Paul announcement happens. If you are a U.S. resident and you hear about this, you're like, okay, he's moving to Puerto Rico, he's getting some tax breaks. But how does that affect Puerto Ricans? What is the context? What's the backdrop of his move? What does that mean for the people living there? And, I think he made it clear in his announcement that he wasn't very familiar with Puerto Rico before he decided to come visit and move here. If he thought, I thought it was more third world, he said. So I think that that's what I can provide, that perspective. And it created a lot of conversation. I mean, on TikTok, it has like 900,000 views, and people are in the comments going back and forth from different perspectives. And again, I invite that, just the conversation about it. But you can't have the conversation if you don't have the facts of the situation. And that's what I try to give people.
That's really amazing. And it's really interesting what you said about how it's considered like international news. I want to put up, we got a couple comments in the section, so I want to put those up on the screen. Someone said, my goodness, I've been following her stories for a bit now and find her incredibly talented, but listening to her in an interview has captivated me on another level. Hey, shout out AC. Thank you for leaving a comment. If you have any questions, please do. I will put them up on the screen. That's why we go live. Second comment from AC. Bianca's compassion, introspection, and intellect is phenomenal. I would gladly travel to the motherland PR to have the opportunity to take her on a single date and share deep intellectual conversation. Hey, shoot your shot, man. Shout out AC. Thank you for commenting on here. That's why we go live, so that people can join and be part of the conversation. I used to do these where I would just record them and upload them later, but I do really enjoy streaming, and I enjoy like the interactiveness of people asking questions. Now, about the Logan Paul thing. So I think that we're going to see more of this. When I first read the news story, I was like, all right, this is like, I think like wealthy Americans are just starting to realize, hey, wait a minute, we don't just have to go to Texas and Florida if we want like tax incentives. Like we could go to Puerto Rico. And I feel like now with the increase in remote work because of the pandemic, I feel like we're going to see more and more stories of like this, where wealthy mainlanders move to Puerto Rico specifically for that. And I don't know if it's already been happening, but I feel like this will definitely accelerate it.
Yes. And I think it's happening more and more. These tax breaks are not new. They were established in 2012. So we're talking, 9 years? So the reality is that people are starting to learn about it more and more. And yeah, like you said, it's this idea that in the past that you would always see this conversation of like, oh yeah, California, you want to implement more taxes, then all these people are going to leave. It was like a threat. And now, to say, it's almost like this idea that whoever offers the better deal for the people moving would benefit from their presence. But that sounds really different when it's Puerto Rico, when it's a place that has a colonial history, when it's a place that's in massive debt, when it's a place that people are suffering the consequences of austerity measures. So it's not the same to say that someone is moving from California to Texas, which is a huge place with very different conditions, and another state that's part of the union versus a place like Puerto Rico that has such a like limbo status. So again, I just felt like it was my job to give the facts of the situation, because again, it's such a small island, and it's also a place where a lot of people have had to move, and where people continue to move all the time, not because they want to, but because they have to, because they don't have opportunities here. So it's happening against a lot of pain. The backdrop is a lot of pain. Am I saying that the people moving here are responsible for that? No, of course not. But it is important to know the context in which it's happening.
And I would love to get into the whole topic of statehood, because I think this is really an interesting subject that is pretty complex, that has been way too overly simplified to, on a national level, Democrats for it, Republicans against it. So, for example, the previous governor Wanda Vasquez, she caucuses on a national level with Republicans. She actually endorsed Donald Trump, but she was pro-statehood. The one representative, what is her name? Jennifer Gonzalez Colon. She's the island's current resident commissioner. She caucuses as well on a national level with the GOP, but she's also a pro-statehood activist. So this idea that like Democrats for, Republicans against is, I think, a way too overly simplified way to look at it. What are your thoughts on this? I know that you're a journalist, you're a reporter, so like sometimes you want to just put the facts out there, you don't want to put your opinion, but I would personally love to hear like what your thoughts are on this whole situation of statehood, independence, Commonwealth, the status, just all that.
Well, I can give you my analysis of the facts. Okay. I think it's a much more complicated situation than people in the US understand it to be. Because again, I don't expect a US resident who didn't hear much about Puerto Rico when they were going to school and its history to understand the complexity of Puerto Rican politics, right? So you're right. I mean, you have the one person who represents Puerto Rico at a national and federal level, who has been very vocal, or had been very vocal about her support for President Trump at the time. So very much someone who's Republican. And yes, the governor at the time, who wasn't elected, you know, once the governor, Ricardo Rosselló, had to step down, then she came in as the governor, but also identified as a Republican. So I think saying that if Puerto Rico becomes a state, it's automatically going to be a blue state and it's going to add Democratic senators is oversimplifying the situation. You have to understand the conservative nature of social issues in Puerto Rico, for example, and also the conservative leaning nature of some of the politicians that are part of the statehood party. So the party that it's very interesting because you have politicians, the Republican politicians, some of them openly against even discussing statehood for Puerto Rico. Some Democrats saying, this is on the agenda, we want to make this happen. I mean, I did a video about this, about how during the Georgia election, the special election, part of the platform of the Republicans, what they were saying is part of the radical agenda of Democrats is to give statehood to Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C., and we can't let that happen. At the same time, you have politicians who literally run on the promise to make Puerto Rico a state, affiliating themselves to the Republican Party. So you have this kind of like crisscross, and then people who support independence for Puerto Rico are more on the left-leaning side when it comes to their platform, and when it comes, you know, to their values. So the way that politics plays out in Puerto Rico is very different to the way it plays out at the federal level. And I think those complexities need to be understood before we talk, you know, about that conversation about what can Puerto Rico be. And, you know, and the idea is that, yes, Puerto Ricans have voted on it 6 times now, but it hasn't really meant anything because these are non-binding referendums. and there has been, a mix of results. And at the end of the day, Congress says it's non-binding and it's not a clear representation of what Puerto Ricans want. So we're not going to talk about it right now. And that's why, the status is still in limbo.
Another question here. Let's see. Have a very serious question for Ms. Graulau. I'm very disturbed by the constant comparisons of world events like COVID, the migrant crisis, climate change to Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. Political leaders and candidates running for office have ran with this claim for years. What is Ms. Graulau's stance on this issue? If she believes this comparison to be false, what would she say to candidates on either side who continue to... I'm not sure what you're trying to say, Dark Sage 9117. If you could clarify that, I would love to ask, but I'm not too sure. Do you know what they're saying?
I think they're asking the comparisons between these like terrible events like the pandemic and climate change to the Holocaust, and how that he or she or they believe that's disturbing. I mean, I think the Holocaust was obviously something absolutely horrific that you can't just be comparing to just anything. So that's as much as I have to say about that.
Yeah, Dark Sage, if you could drop like a specific instance where somebody has done this, I would love to. Like, I'm not too sure what you're saying, what you're addressing right now, but if you got a specific, definitely drop it in there and we'll address it. But yeah, I think that the whole Mitch McConnell, he constantly always says, oh, Democrats want to do this. It's government overreach. They just want the Senate to be in their control. It'll always be in their control forever. And I've heard a couple other Republicans at the national level say this. And I always think, like, I'm not too sure if it would automatically be blue. It could be a 50-50 split, like one senator being Democrat, one senator being Republican. It could go both ways, Republican. Like, it's just not that simple. And even then, like, let's say for whatever reason, it is going to be a Democrat state. I don't think that that's a good enough reason to literally like have a whole nation of people, millions of people hanging in limbo because you don't want your political opposition to have like a one up on you. Like if you really cared about this issue so much, then you would find a way to appeal to those voters so that they don't become a blue state. Like that is the way to properly address those concerns. Like, oh, they're going to be a blue state automatically. What can we do to appeal to their votes? Not let's just throw away like whatever concern they have, like, or whatever benefits could go to them because, you know, we're in this game of back and forth tic-tac-toe with Democrats. Like, I never thought that was a valid excuse from Mitch McConnell and the Republicans, like just in general, to leave a whole state's like status in limbo like that. But so like you said, there's been 6 referendums throughout the times. Like 1967 was the first one, 1993, 1998, 2012, 2017, 2020. It seems like, so the last few, 2020 and 2017, they voted in favor of statehood. The 2017 one is interesting because it only had a 23% turnout, and I was reading it's because the PPD party decided to boycott it. I never understood the point of boycotting something. Like, let's just not show up. If Democrats said we're gonna boycott the general election and Trump just went in there and won, I would have been so mad. I think everybody would have been mad. It's like, you can't just give up.
But let me tell you why. Let me tell you why it was seen as a legitimate move. Again, first of all, it didn't happen during a general election. So you're asking people to go vote for this one single issue, knowing that it's non-binding, knowing that it will not change anything because it's not forcing Congress to do anything. In fact, when they do these referendums, we get a pretty clear idea of whether the White House and Congress is on board or not. And if Puerto Ricans are saying that Congress and the White House say, we don't support it, we're not giving you money for your referendum, and we're not part of this, then Puerto Ricans have a really good reason to say, you know, I'm not going to go vote today for just, you know, a parade or a symbolic gesture, especially when they're using local taxpayer money to pay for it. Because again, in these instances, the federal government says, we're not giving you funding for that referendum. So it's a way of protesting it because they believe it's all for show. And they were right, because at the end of the day, during that referendum, even though there's the element of it having been boycotted, it got 97% support for statehood. it's been 4 years. We're in 2021. That happened in 2017. So the point of boycotting it is to say we're not going to continue to participate in this, activity that's all for show, especially when you have the federal government, those who hold the power, saying we're not participating in this. So this time around, I think the people who oppose statehood took a different route, and they said, let's vote against it because we're going out to vote anyway. At first, the first move was to say, let's just not have this referendum at all. We're spending millions of dollars doing this, and we don't have the buy-in of the federal government. But once they couldn't stop that because the party in favor was the statehood party, then they said, let's vote against it. The argument for this referendum would be that only, a 30-something% turnout was what we had for that election in 2020 in a place like Puerto Rico usually has a pretty high turnout. So it was a low turnout compared to other elections. And then you had a pretty close vote. I believe it was 52 versus 47%, 52% being for statehood. So then the idea is,
sorry, my bad. It said registered voter turnout was actually at like 55% this time in 2020.
Right.
Which is around the same thing as like the 2016 general election was like about 55% voter turnout.
The 2016 election in
general election. No. In the United States, the Hillary.
In the United
Trump
States,
one.
right?
Yeah.
So usually you have a higher turnout in Puerto Rico than you have in the States when it comes to elections. So you're right. I was confused with the 30-something%. It's about half of the registered population that went out to vote, and then you have half of those voting in favor of statehood. So then what people are saying is that that's a smaller percentage of the population than you would want to have, especially when we're talking about statehood for DC, which has such a high percentage of support versus a place like Puerto Rico, which is to say we're not first in line. So what makes you think that it's going to happen after this referendum? So we'll have to see. We'll have to see what happens now that Democrats are in power.
Yeah, I was going to say the 2017 one is an interesting one to hold because it's like at that time, the Republicans still controlled Senate and the House and the presidency. There was no way that it was going to get through with Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell in control. So I don't even know why they held one in 2017 before the House even flipped blue in a year later. But now with Biden has been asked a couple times, and every time he's asked, he always says, I think it's up to the people of Puerto Rico to decide that. And the only way for the people of Puerto Rico to decide would be with a referendum vote, right? So like, what is the solution there? Because now it seems like Biden is kind of kicking it back to Puerto Rico saying, well, what do you guys think? They're making a vote and then nothing is getting done with it.
Yeah, which is what has been happening for decades, They always say that, it's up to the people of Puerto Rico. You go back and you see, Obama clips, same thing. It's up to the people of Puerto Rico. So I think it just goes to prove what people thought, that this referendum wasn't going to mean anything, because what Biden has said is that the people of Puerto Rico have to take a vote, but that just means that he's not taking this one into account. So it has to be a vote that everyone's on board with from the beginning. You know what I mean? So it's a tricky issue, and we would have to see. I think that would be a much better measure to see whether the people of Puerto Rico really want statehood or not, if you have a referendum where they know something's going to come out of it, because people will actually have an incentive to come out and vote. And I do think that in the past it has been this idea that people in the US have that, of course, Puerto Rico wants to be a state. Why wouldn't they? But it's not the same to say that Washington, D.C. wants to be a state and Puerto Rico wants to be a state. There's a lot of complexity in that. And again, the percentages are different when you compare a place like D.C. and Puerto Rico. And it might very well be that once you have a binding referendum, the majority does vote for statehood. But we just haven't had one of those serious referendums. So we would have to do that. And now you have the AOC and Velázquez bill, the proposal to have Puerto Ricans elect delegates that would then craft the possibilities for a status for Puerto Rico. Because in the past, the big controversy and the big issue that people have had is that whatever party is in power, they're the ones who craft the definition of what are the options. So not everyone gets equal opportunity, right? Like not everyone gets a say on what is the definition. And then you have the party in power defining these are the options, and then the opposition party saying we don't agree with that. So then what these two Congress members are proposing would be that it would be the Puerto Rican people who elect delegates who then craft the option so that it's fair and so that it is what the Puerto Rican people want and not what's being imposed on them. So.
And so there's obviously the option of statehood and then independence, but there are, I guess, some people who would like to remain as the status quo right now, to remain a commonwealth. What are the pros of that? Like, what do they go out and campaign on by saying, like, let's stay how we are, when the people of Puerto Rico clearly see that it's not working? Like, what I don't understand. What are the pros of remaining a commonwealth?
I think the number one issue is the identity issue. So if you're scared, and there have been a lot of scare tactics in Puerto Rico when it comes to the status issue, even during this election, there was a lot of fear mongering that you can agree with or not. But the reality is that Puerto Ricans have been told, if you separate from the United States, you know you're going to end up like XYZ, whatever country people think is a bad example, right? So that's what happened. What happens on that side. On the other side, the thread is, do you want to become Hawaii? So usually the conversation goes like this: do you want to be Cuba? No, you don't want to end up like that. Or do you want to be Hawaii? No. So depending on where you land with your ideals, that's sort of like the rhetoric. Hawaii being the example of a place that some people believe have lost their identity because once they became a U.S. state. And again, you may agree with that or not, but that's kind of the argument when people say, let's stay the way we are, because that way we're not completely separated from the U.S. We don't have to fear, losing some of the advantages of being associated with the U.S., but we get to keep our identity, and we get to still compete at a national level when it comes to sports, when it comes to big events, and we have that Puerto Rican pride. And then on the other hand, you have a small percentage of the population that says enough is enough, and we've had all these years of being a colony and all these years of being a limbo, like give us our independence so that we can fend for ourselves and we can do it, right? But up until now, I think that has been a small percent of the population. But I will say that during this election, there was a lot more support for the Independence Party than there has been in the past. So I think that the younger generation is kind of losing that fear of the separation from the U.S. And I think they're seeing the possibility of Puerto Rico being independent differently. But again, it continues to be small compared to the two major parties of status quo, which is Commonwealth or statehood. But I do think the tides are turning.
Yeah. That goes into a couple of different questions that I had. So I actually would like to speak to some Native Hawaiians and get their perspective on if they've lost their culture, because I don't know. It's always been to me like, if you join and you become part of the union, there will obviously be more access to federal tax dollars when it comes to disasters and stuff. I think around the time of Hurricane Maria, there was another hurricane that had hit Texas or Alabama. I can't remember what it was, but it seemed like the federal aid went there way faster than the time that it got to Puerto Rico. So I've always seen it as that. I never understood the Commonwealth argument, but now that makes sense. Like, if you're afraid to become something like, for example, Dominican Republic, which I don't think is doing horrible, but it's definitely not up there in terms of GDP and other industrialized nations. So I could see that being like, do you want to end up like Dominican Republic, or do you want to end up like Hawaii? Are you worried that Puerto Rico would lose their culture if admitted as a state? Because I was doing a little bit of research. There's obviously a lot that goes into how Hawaii became a state. They became a state in 1959. I feel like people think that they became a state way, way longer than they actually did. It's only been like 70 something years. When they became a state, they established in 1978 the Hawaii State Constitutional Convention. It created an ambitious project of preservation of the Hawaiian culture, including the adoption of Hawaiian diacritical marks. and they made Hawaiian language become the official state language of Hawaii. That was, I don't know how the extent of what it's worked. I'd obviously have to do more research on that, but that was something that they put in place to address the concerns that they would lose their native cultures. Are you worried that Puerto Rico could lose their culture if admitted as a state? Because I could totally see like a scenario in the future where a president similar to Donald Trump with his ideology threatens to withhold federal funds for whatever reason and says, if you don't make English the main language that is taught in schools, we will withhold federal funding, or other threats like that. Like, is that kind of what the worry is?
I think I will say two things. I think, you in Puerto Rico, I think we have a need to educate ourselves when it comes to other countries and other possibilities. I think we're very restricted in terms of looking up there in the world to see other examples of how other countries, succeed, which is more than GDP, right? GDP is one measure, but there are other ways in which countries are able to thrive as independent countries. And in fact, I think there's a big misunderstanding, and people in Puerto Rico, they have associated independence with such negative consequences that I actually have seen a clip of people being interviewed in the street, and when they're asked what country is independent, they have a hard time coming up with something different than Cuba or Venezuela. And in fact, when they're asked, is the United States independent? They're like, no.
What
and
do
it's
they
hard
think
for them to it's hard for them to understand, again, because the campaign has been so strong in associating independence with scarcity and turmoil and poverty, that it's hard for people to associate independence with, a country that they deem successful, like the United States. So that's a side note to say that I think the conversation has been controlled in a way that people need a little bit more like perspectives in order to truly appreciate the scope of the issue. And on the other hand, you talk about Hawaii. The reality is that I'm also in the process of learning more about what happened in Hawaii, and I've been saving a couple of articles on. Right now there's a documentary that's coming out precisely on that, and I have seen the conversation. I'll post a video about Puerto Rico and I'll get comments being like, don't do it, look at us in Hawaii, have we lost our identity? So there, and I've seen videos go viral talking about that, how there's like currently a fight to go back to their roots and rescue what was theirs that they feel has been taken away. So I'm sure there are Hawaiians who disagree and say, it's a wonderful thing that we're part of the union, and no, like, we're still proud Hawaiians. But there is a section of the Hawaiian population that feels otherwise. And again, I'm in the process of educating myself. I would love to watch these documentaries to understand the issue a little bit better. But what I will say is that Puerto Ricans are very proud. Puerto Ricans are very proud of their culture and the language and all these things, that they don't want to feel like they lose it. They don't want to become another star necessarily. And some do. Some very proudly want to be part of the United States, and they see that as the ultimate goal. But you have some people who are like, already feel upset about some of what they believe have been abuses, and believe that, especially with how things have gone lately with the United States and sort of the image of the United States in the world stage, they question why Puerto Rico would want to be part of the United States. And again, that's one perspective. But I think what's important is to get a true feel and an answer from Puerto Ricans. What is it that the majority wants, so that we can move towards that? Because I think if there's something that there's agreement on, is that the current status is not working for anyone. And in fact, you'll hear candidates for governor get on a debate stage and say, this is a colony and we cannot continue with this colonial status. So I think there's agreement that there has to be a change. And I think people need to agree on how to make that happen, because I think it's getting late for the Puerto Ricans suffering the consequences of that limbo.
Yeah. And so in my research before this, like, the Hawaii Admission Act which brought Hawaii into the Union, was actually signed first by President Eisenhower, and then they held a referendum afterwards, after they had already signed this. So it was kind of like, all right, do you want to accept the passage of this act? And then the people voted on that, which that got 93% vote for in support. It was very, very few, the opposition. But I would like to read some of what the opposition at the time was, because it is strikingly similar to like the opposition you hear nowadays. So this is from Alice Kamokila Campbell on the 53rd anniversary of the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Then Territorial Senator Alice, one of the few voices that opposed statehood for Hawaii, offered her testimony. She said, "I do not feel that we should forfeit the traditional rights and privileges of the natives of our islands for a mere thimbleful of votes in Congress, that we, the lovers of Hawaii from long association with it, should sacrifice our birthright for the greed of alien desires to remain on our shores, that we should satisfy the thirst for power and control of some inflated industrialists and politicians who hide under the guise of friends of Hawaii, yet still keeping an eagle eye on the financial and political pressure button of subjugation over the people in general of these islands." Like, that sounds sort of similar to what the opposition says today. And then I looked at what the Southern lawmakers at the time were saying in their opposition to wanting Hawaii, because there was many bills like Hawaii. Some had said, some who proponents of statehood had said that Hawaii should have been a state like years, maybe 60 years before it actually had become. But in Congress, those bills kept getting held up by Southern lawmakers who said, oh, you know, there's a threat that they'll have dual loyalty. They could fall to socialism. Who knows? They were worried about having a state with an ethnic minority be the majority, which was Asian Americans at the time. So there was a lot of just arguments that sound like the arguments today. And I think that more people, I guess there's obviously a lot of differences between Hawaii. Like, Hawaii was a kingdom at first. There's a lot of different ways that they kind of whitewash their culture through just forcing them to be Catholic and other different things that I need to look more into. But I think there is lessons that should be learned, like the way that they passed the act first and then held a referendum, instead of holding all these costly referendums that you say obviously like do take up taxpayer dollars.
Yeah, but I think it's important that the people of Puerto Rico say what they want before anything is imposed on them. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I think there has to be, the issue hasn't been that we've been asking the people of Puerto Rico. The issue has been that we've been asking them symbolically and not like with a promise that change will come. So then people don't know what to make of that. So if there's something I can tell you confidently, is that there has to be a serious attempt to get the feelings, the desires, and the decision of the Puerto Rican people. What is it that they want?
Yeah. And so I wanted to ask you about a third party, the Movimiento Victoria Ciudadana. They were a third party where their position on statehood wasn't that clear to me. It kind of seemed like they were just like, let's not make it a priority. Like, something has to be done about this status, but it doesn't have to be our first number one priority. Question number one, do you think that they have a chance of growing bigger and kind of disrupting the hold that the two more traditional parties have had for so long? Like, I think they gained, what was it, 2 representatives in the House. They might have 1 senator. Do you think that they have a chance to grow bigger? Because I know here in the mainland, the Green Party, the Libertarian Party, they try, but like the duopoly that the Democrats and the Republicans have is almost impossible to break. Like, I don't even think the Green Party is on a lot of ballots in a lot of states. Like, is it possible in Puerto Rico for a third party to succeed?
I think we saw in this election sort of the first taste of what is possible for the people who are tired of the two main parties. And I think they celebrated that quite a bit, because it was the first time ever that you had such a high percentage vote for something other than the two major parties. So I don't know. I don't know what the political makeup is going to look like 4 years from now. But I can say that this was a very strong conversation leading up to the election, which was, let's stop voting for the same traditional parties that these people would say is have done no good for us. We have to vote differently. And I think there was a little bit of disappointment from those people who were pushing really hard for that change to see one of the two major parties get elected again for the governor's seat. but I think that there was some hope that they
Mm-hmm.
saw in the possibility of having another party, like you said, that is not based on status. And I mean, if now Democrats are in power and the status issue is resolved, which for Puerto Rican, that sounds like a long shot because I've been hearing this my whole life that we're going to do something about the status and it hasn't happened. But if it were to happen in these 4 years that is resolved, then I wonder what the political makeup is going to look like locally, because then parties will no longer be running on the status issue if it's something that's done. So I think, and it wasn't just, Movimiento Victoria Ciudadana. There was also another party that's a conservative party that also saw some, and it leaned heavily on churches and churchgoers and part of the population that didn't want to vote for the two main parties, but that was conservative in their values. So I think the problem is that what the people who want to see those two parties defeated, the problem for them is that protest vote is split. It's split between people who are conservative and voting for this Proyecto de Unidad, that was the party, or Movimiento Victoria Ciudadana, or the Independence Party. So I think the issue would be uniting that protest vote because their values are so different, right, when it comes to social issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's tough. It's easy to agree on problems. I think it's harder to agree on solutions. So I think that's where, even here in the mainland, like when on certain issues, like let's say the Robin Hood thing that just happened, you saw people from the conservative aisle voicing their concern. You saw people from the progressive wing, but coming to agreement on problems is pretty easy. Saying that is messed up and we need to fix that is pretty easy. Finding the actual solution, I think, is the hard part. And I read a great article in NPR about the younger Puerto Ricans that are now moving towards this, and they're saying how they're just fed up with the other parties and how they hadn't voted in 2016 because they were just kind of like, oh, what's the point? But in 2020, they were actually looking forward to voting. So it's really interesting just to see what is happening in the change of attitudes as newer generations get into the voting process. Is it possible to actually prioritize Puerto Rico's problems, whether it be infrastructure, healthcare, without prioritizing the question of statehood? Or is do you have to, address the status before you even address anything else? Is that possible?
That's a good question. And that's something that politicians debate. Some people say, we don't need to talk about status right now, put that on hold. And some people say that's the root of everything. We have to know where the funding is coming from. How do we, either lobby the US to do our due diligence when it comes to, a territory of the US or a state of the US, or how to do things on our own while still keeping the US accountable for the years that they were here. So I think there's differing opinions when it comes to that too. Some people will say there's no way to delay the status issue because that's where everything starts. And some other people say we need to stop talking about status. And that's why movements like Movimiento Victoria Ciudadana are we're not going to run on the issue of status. We're going to run on taking care of people and really representing them and ending corruption. And then we're going to look for a good solution for status.
That's interesting because I feel that's the number one thing that I think of when I think of Puerto Rico, which brings me to my next question. So the movement there isn't as strongly in favor of statehood as Washington, D.C., but the movement in general to figure out the status is definitely something that I hear more when it comes to Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. I don't even know if there's a movement for let's say U.S. territories like Guam, the U.S. Virgin Islands, America Samoa. Why is it that Puerto Rico, the movement is this is such a big discussion, whereas the U.S. Virgin Islands, it's not so much? Is it just because of, the economics that go in place and things like Hurricane Maria showing look, we need to figure this out because last time the aid was just a big blunder? Is that why those things that make the movement there so vocal and prominent? Because I don't know if I've ever heard it for Samoa, U.S. Virgin Islands, all those other territories that are territories.
Right. I think it's a couple things. I think it's, population. Puerto Rico has more than 3 million citizens, U.S. citizens living on the island. And then I think it's also some of those major events that have put Puerto Rico in people's radar. You're talking about Hurricane Maria and everything that happened. Like, pretty much everyone saw those images, and pretty much everyone saw the devastation and the need for response. So I think it's those things combined. But you bring it up, and that's an important point. We can't forget about the other territories. And right now, there's actually a big case going on when it comes to SSI, the social security benefits that the territories get that are not up to par with what states get, and how the Trump administration was very much fighting that, to say we don't have to pay them the same that we pay the states, even if they contribute to the treasury, even if they pay taxes. So, and Guam, for example, is a part of that discussion too. So a lot of times Puerto Ricans will say, include us in the conversation and talk about this so that we can see a resolution to our issues. We can't forget that we have brothers and sisters in other territories that are going through very similar things too.
Yeah. And then, so what is Act 20 and Act 22 in Puerto Rico? These are two acts, along with the Jones Act, that I always hear about. Some people think that just repealing the Jones Act is where things should start. Before you even address the question of status, just repeal the Jones Act. Could we give the listeners and the viewers a couple of examples? What are these acts, and how do they affect the island?
Yeah, so Jones Act is a protectionist act, which it affects Puerto Rico, but it's really for the general United States, where the products that are transported from one U.S. port to another have to be transported on U.S. vessels with a majority U.S. crew. Mm-hmm. The thing is that transportation, that maritime, am I pronouncing that right?
Maritime? I think so.
Okay, marítimo, the maritime transportation in the U.S. is the most expensive. So that transportation cost is then passed on to the consumer. Mm-hmm. So that's why you have in a place like Puerto Rico that products are that much more expensive. And we're talking like essential things like food and fuel. So I think it's especially offensive for some people in Puerto Rico, because they're like, we're a territory, but we have to abide by these laws that were imposed on us. And at the end of the day, we're the ones who pay the price. But some people will defend the law by saying, this is a way that you protect U.S. jobs. This is a way that you protect our industry to make sure that you're using U.S. services. But it comes at a cost. And a lot of times it is people who pay that cost. And then Act 20 and Act 22 is what we were talking about, which is the tax breaks that invite wealthy people to move to Puerto Rico. So, for example, Act 22 is for individuals. And, under Act 22, you have the 0% capital gains tax, which is huge for people with investments. So it's that's attracting a lot of people. And the argument would be that doesn't really help Puerto Ricans, because it doesn't attract jobs, and it doesn't attract any guaranteed investments. You can come here and be, like you said, a digital nomad and work remotely and just not pay any taxes, but you do have the means to pay for property. That then means that, you're taking up resources in a place where, Puerto Ricans are already struggling. So that would be the argument against it. But then other people say, they come here and they spend money. So that helps the government, especially when we have such a high tax sales. So that's why it's so controversial. And that those acts, the Act 20 and Act 22, is what everyone was talking about when Logan Paul made his announcements.
And then, so context on the Jones Act for everyone. I think it was passed during like wartime, like when there was a need to make sure that the shipping and the importing and all that was done through American vessels and not done by like a different country, because it was during the war. So they just wanted to ensure that it was all like American first. Now the Act 20 and Act 22, when I was researching this, I came across a society that it's like Society 2022 or something. And like, it seemed kind of nefarious, like just the name of it. I was like, this seems like a sketchy, like dark hooded robes, like we are the society. And then it seems like they're mainly just like a lobbyist group that makes sure to keep these incentives in place. They lobby, I'm sure, politicians to make sure that they don't get rid of them. And then they probably disguise like what they're doing with by saying, not disguise, but they can say, turn around and say, look, we do a lot of charity work. So we do work for this, and like we have a nonprofit and all this. But at the core of it, it seems like it's a lobbyist group that just wants to make sure that those acts are in place and don't go away.
They definitely look out for the interests of the people who are the beneficiaries of these acts, right? Like they're very much open about that. That is their purpose. So they make it a point to look out for them in whatever that means when it comes to the acts themselves, and helping people when they want to move here with resources and connections. So yeah, I mean, if you're someone who is against Act 20 and Act 22, then you're not going to have a good image of that. But it's a resource for people who do want to move here and are kind of lost when it comes to how to make it happen. Then you have groups like that which will hold their hand through the process.
It's interesting because I've spoken to digital nomads. I know a couple. I've interviewed a couple, and the ones that I know, like they're making their income off of like writing and like gigs like that, virtual assistants. There's not, I don't think I know any digital nomads that even have capital gains, which is like, the profit that is made on selling an asset. So it could be property, it could be stocks and stuff. I don't know too many digital nomads that are into that. Like the ones that I know, at least, they're like, bloggers, they do virtual assistant jobs, and they seem like they don't have that much money as compared to the people that are really, really taking advantage of Act 20 and Act 22.
I think it's clear that the people taking advantage of it are wealthy recipients, right? When you talk about someone like Logan Paul, he has investments, and he's made a lot of money throughout his career. So I don't think the right image, and it would be fair to say that the people moving here are, people who quit their jobs and are just like doing their thing as freelancers. That's not representative of the people moving here. So I think that there was just a story in the main newspaper here in Anoalia that there's more demand for homes that are more than $500,000 than there is supply. So that the sale of luxury homes is skyrocketing. Wow. So, you know that the people moving here have a lot of means. And some people will support that. Some people will say the more wealthy people who come here, the more money that's coming into the island. And some other people are saying, no, those are the people who are buying up our land. And then we're going to end up with nothing. And then at the same time that Puerto Ricans are leaving, so then what are we going to be left with? What is this island going to become? So yeah, that's the controversy that's playing out right now.
Yeah. I have like a love-hate relationship for digital nomads because sometimes I see them in articles. Like there was an article about a digital nomad couple that got deported from Bali that I covered. They got deported because they were literally telling people how to move there and how to evade tax laws during a pandemic in which Bali was telling people not to move there. So it's like, but some digital nomads that I know, they love the places that they go to. They love being surrounded by the locals. They love like learning about the cultures around them. Like they really immerse themselves into where they are. They're not just like in a gated community as Logan Paul is going to be. Like they're really in there. They're walking around with the people. They're like really, really, really immersed in the culture. So like digital nomads, it's like a tricky thing. I know that, they should be paying taxes. And I think there's countries such as Barbados that's created a digital nomad visa where it's a little bit easier now to move there if you're a digital nomad, but I guess there's now more regulation around it. So I think maybe that's something that I don't even know if Puerto Rico would be allowed to do that considering their territorial status, like just create a digital nomad visa.
I think Puerto Ricans are 100% restricted in what they can do, and they have to follow U.S. laws when it comes to immigration laws. So, the reality is that you can be for or against paying taxes and make the right choice for you, depending on what your view is, your ideal, and how much money you want to legally pay into the treasury and the system or not. But again, what I can contribute as a reporter is the context around it, because what I can tell you confidently is that we all have a responsibility of knowing the impact we have, and especially places that have gone through a lot. And I think Puerto Rico is one of those. So if after you have all that information, you still make your choice, that's totally up to you, whatever you can do according to the laws. But I can give you the context of why people are for or against it, and also the efforts to either strengthen those laws or take them down. What I posted today was about Senator Chuck Schumer expressing how he's against Act 20 and Act 22, and how he believes we need to do away with them because he doesn't agree with wealthy people moving here to not pay taxes. So I think Logan
he was
Paul
kind of snappy about it, right? He was kind of like snappy the way he responded.
Right. So I think this Logan Paul thing has reignited that conversation, which I think for a little bit was kind of going under the radar. Brock Pierce has done that too. So I don't know. I will tell you that there are a lot of groups here who feel very strongly about it, and they're trying to figure out how to organize to oppose it. So the current administration seems to support it. The current local administration seems to support it. So again, because the views are so different, you have the statehood party here. Very much, a lot of prominent politicians in the statehood party have supported that legislation. And then you have someone high ranking in the Democratic Party like Senator Chuck Schumer saying, let's get rid of that. We can't have that. So that's where the complexities of local and federal politics come into play.
It's very, very complex. Now, I have to do it because I've asked a lot of other people who have come on here. Have you done any study into what the attitude in Puerto Ricans have towards the term Latinx? Like, have you looked into that at all? Like, or maybe even just subjective, like some anecdotes of what you've seen. Like, how do people feel there towards the term Latinx?
Yeah, I can give you anecdotes. Is what I can give you, and it's based on just conversations that I've seen. I think I've actually have seen these conversations play out in my own friend groups of people saying, "You're messing up the language. You can't pronounce that in Spanish. When you say Latinx, you are speaking English because you can pronounce it there, but in Spanish, you want to say Latina, Latino. So what some people have adopted and very much use is using the E as a gender neutral option, Latine.
I just found out about that one.
Yeah, so then you would say amigas, amigos, amigues, puertorriqueños. I think it's something that you see more in like younger groups of like activists and people who are very involved. I think you would have a harder time convincing people from my dad's generation. He would very much say, I am never saying Puertorriqueño or Latines, So I think very much how you see this conversation play out in conservative groups versus more liberal groups, and this effort to be inclusive. And I've had to wrestle with this question as a reporter when I'm doing these stories, because on the one hand, it's like, you're going to tell us how to speak our language. You're going to have, English speaking people from the US tell us how we have to identify. And then other people saying like, well, no, we just have to be inclusive. We just have to make sure that we're not alienating people. So I also think it's important to realize that, the Latino, Latina population still carries very much conservative values. So you have to take that into consideration. But I just don't have a problem. And I think, and I saw this conversation happen between Latina journalists about whether to use the X. And some people are very much like, I won't do that because that's not our language. And other people were like, and I think I take more this position that I will respect what the people I'm interviewing and reporting on choose. So if I'm talking to someone who identifies as a Puertorriqueña, that's what I'm going to say. Puertorriqueña, it just depends. So I think it's more of a like case by case basis. I think where the controversy comes in when we're talking about the population as a whole.
That's my stance on it as well. It's just like, you let me know. Like if I mess up at first, I will correct it and I will not continue to misname it afterwards. Just let me know. I think when it gets tricky is, so what about like in education? Do you now put this into the curriculum? Like, do you teach Latinx, Latine in the curriculum? That's where like you really, really have to figure it out. And I don't know. For the longest time, I was just like, I'm Dominican. That's it. If you ask me what am I, I'm Dominican. That's what I say. I'm not Latino. I'm not Hispanic. I'm Dominican. Like, I don't know what else people would say. And I think I saw a study. I brought this up in one of my previous interviews where it was like most of the Latin countries, like if you ask them where are you from, they say so. Like if you're Mexican, you say I'm Mexican. If you're from Cuba, you say I'm Cuban. And like it's not a majority. It's like a small percentage. Not, I don't know how small, but that say I'm Hispanic or I'm Latino, I'm Latina, I'm Latinx. Like I think most people just say I'm from this country. It seems like
That's an
this.
important point. And that's part of what that conversation was like, of saying we're not a monolith. And I think you should identify people depending on where they come from. And
Mhm,
when you're speaking in English, that gets rid of that issue because you're saying Puerto Rican. Puerto Rican is gender neutral. Or you're
mhm,
saying, Mexican, and that's gender neutral. So I think that's an important point that some people are bringing up. Like, don't call us Latinx because you know, aside from the issue of we might not be okay with, that kind of anglicized pronunciation, you're also just kind of grouping us together when there are complexities that set us apart.
mhm. Yeah, it's super interesting, and I don't know. I made it a point to I'm gonna ask all Latino Latinas who come on the show to see like what they think about it. Had to ask. I definitely wanted to know like what the people of Puerto Rico thought because it could see, like I could totally see it as if you're in a different Latin country and you just hear this for the first time, you're like, what the hell? Like
Mm-hmm.
elites and the elitists in the United States are trying to change our language and tell us what to do. But it does seem like the term was originated from non-binary Latinos and Latinas or Latinx, non-binary and transgender people that associated with Latinx. Like they're the ones like we need a term to describe ourselves, and we're not Latino, we're not Latino, we're non-binary. So I don't know. I'm gonna always keep asking people what they think because I think it's just subjective. I remember I uploaded something to Reddit that said Latinx, and I've never received so many hate comments. Like so many people just saying like, "That's don't stop calling us that. That's not what
Yeah.
we are. Stop trying to change us." And I was like, "Whoa, I didn't know that many people were this like angry about it." But
Yeah, they
I don't
feel
know.
very strongly about it.
Yeah, it stirs people up. I've never seen that before. Like I'll upload other content and it's just like pretty neutral, and then I uploaded that something where it's like what do you think about the term Latinx? Hate, just anger, just straight up anger. Oh man, but yeah, so I'm gonna keep asking people. So what future projects are you looking forward to as we wrap up?
A lot. I have this ongoing list of stories that I want to work on. I'm currently working on one, and when we're done here, I'm going to go right back to working on it. It's a story about the history of agriculture in Puerto Rico and why it is that we no longer produce most of what we eat and we're so dependent on imports. So that's one story. And then I'm working on a project about renewable energy in Puerto Rico and sort of the efforts that have been springing up since Hurricane Maria and how people have kind of taken it upon themselves to just change the energy future of Puerto Rico and make it based on renewable energy. Yeah, I have several stories. I want to do like an actual video on the whole Act 20 and Act 22 issue and controversy going on. So yeah, I'll keep posting about all of those on my social media.
Well, all of those sound like amazing topics and definitely things that like I don't know. Here in the mainland, the only time Puerto Rico really comes up in the news is if like the protests were happening, or Hurricane Maria. Like after that, it really does just like fade into the background because there's so much going on. So like I understand like COVID, presidential stuff, like it's just a lot. So I feel like the only time that Puerto Rico really has the spotlight on it in the mainland is when like something bad is happening. So it's great to create that you're creating content that shines a light on the issues that the island is facing, not just in times of catastrophe. Like, Puerto Rico is, people are still there year round when there's not catastrophes happening. So that's really, really important. And how can viewers connect with you and learn more?
They can find me on every social media platform by my name, Bianca Graulau, but it's written Graulau. So Bianca Graulau is just pronounced Graulau. But you can find me on TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. These days I'm using TikTok more and YouTube. So those are like my two main ones.
real different too, because TikTok is like the short content, and then YouTube you got your 10-minute, like 6 to 10 minute videos on there.
Yep.
A real quick question that I forgot to ask: why did you decide to make that video about how Venezuelans are using Bitcoin? It was a little step out of the Puerto Rico realm. Do you plan on doing more stuff like that covers other Latin American countries?
Yeah, 100%. Honestly, it was just when I travel somewhere, I try to do a story about that place. So if you go to my channel, I also have a story about indigenous people in Costa Rica because I was in Costa Rica and I really wanted to shoot a story. I enjoy my travels more when I get to do a story while I'm there. This one just felt a little bit out of place because I was posting it now and I shot it before the pandemic. But I thought it was a really interesting story. And again, I was just traveling there and I thought it was a good opportunity to tell that story. And especially now that everyone's talking about Bitcoin because the price is going so crazy, I thought it was important to give that different perspective. That is not just investment, that for some people, because of the nature of what Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies are, that they're using it literally to survive. So yeah, I will continue to tell stories like that. And once this is all over and we can travel again, I really have a lot of other story ideas in mind that I want to continue to tell. I will always report on Puerto Rico, especially if I'm living here. But yes, I have a lot of story ideas that are from other places too.
Do you think the move to Puerto Rico is going to be permanent? Do you think you'll be staying there, or do you think you got plans to move anywhere else?
For the foreseeable future, yes. And my family's here, so I love being here. And yeah, I see myself here for the foreseeable future. But I also see myself traveling a lot. I really enjoy traveling, especially to tell stories of other places. So I can see myself kind of having home base here, and then going to different places to tell stories there too.
Hey, well, that's amazing. Bianca Graulau, thank you so much for coming on the show. This was great. I really wanted to hear from somebody who covers the issues of Puerto Rico to come on the show and to talk about it. Like I said, it fades into the background with so much news going on, but it's important for people on the mainland to remember that Puerto Rico is a U.S. It's got a complicated situation, but the people there are Americans. You got the blue passport and everything, the United States passport. It's your citizens. Can't forget about you. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Hey, and you are welcome anytime in the future. And let's see if anything happens in these 4 years. I would love to have you back on if some movement starts happening with the status.
Yeah, 100%. Let me know.
Hey, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who came. Thank you to everybody who commented. Dark Sage never commented back. I don't know. I really didn't understand that comment, but thank you to everybody who watched. Thank you to everybody who listened, and peace. We will be back next week with another interview. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.